Every bottle of Scotch whisky on the shelf is trying to tell you a story. The problem is, about half of that story is written in a language the industry designed to be confusing. There are terms on that label that sound impressive but mean almost nothing, terms that are missing entirely because no law requires them, and a few that are actively hiding the truth about what is in your glass. This is how to actually read a Scotch label, and more importantly, what the label is hoping you never bother to look up. Number 12. Small batch, reserve, and handcrafted mean absolutely nothing. These words appear on Scotch bottles constantly, and not one of them has a legal definition. There is no regulation that defines what small batch means. It could be 10 casks or 200. There is no standard for reserve or special reserve. It might mean older stock, a different cask selection, or simply a higher price tag with the same liquid. Handcrafted is technically true of every whiskey ever made because human hands are involved at every distillery on the planet. Artisan and select fall into the same category. None of these terms are enforceable under the Scotch whisky regulations, and none of them require any specific production method, age, cask type, or quality threshold. They exist purely as marketing language, and the industry knows that consumers read them as signals of quality. The next time you see reserve on a bottle that costs £15 more than the standard expression, ask yourself what exactly is being reserved. The label will not answer that question because it does not have to. Number 11. A vintage year without a bottling date is only half the story. Some bottles carry a distillation year on the label. Distilled 2012 or 2010 vintage sounds impressive and specific. But without a bottling date, that number is almost useless. The age of a whiskey is the gap between when it went into the cask and when it came out. A bottle distilled in 2012 and bottled in 2026 is 14 years old. The same bottle distilled in 2012 and bottled in 2016 is 4 years old. Both labels say distilled 2012. Only one of them is a mature whiskey. Independent bottlers almost always print both the distillation year and the bottling year, and often the exact cask number as well. Official distillery bottlings are less consistent. Some include both dates, some include only the vintage. Some print the vintage prominently on the front while hiding the bottling date in small text on the back, or not including it at all. If a bottle gives you a distillation year, look for the bottling date before you draw any conclusions about age. Number 10. The 5 categories you probably cannot name. Walk into any liquor store and ask someone what kinds of Scotch exist, and you will almost certainly hear single malt and blended. Maybe Johnny Walker versus Glenfiddich. That is where the conversation usually stops. But the Scotch whisky regulations of 2009 define 5 legal categories, and understanding all 5 changes how you read every label on the shelf. Single malt Scotch whisky comes from one distillery and is made entirely from malted barley using pot stills. Single grain Scotch whisky also comes from one distillery, but it can use other grains beyond barley and is typically made in a column still. Blended Scotch whisky is a mix of one or more single malts with one or more single grains. Blended malt Scotch whisky, formerly called vatted malt or pure malt, is a blend of single malts from different distilleries with no grain whisky involved at all. And blended grain Scotch whisky is a blend of single grains from multiple distilleries. Every bottle of Scotch must display its category on the front label, and every word in that category name must be given equal prominence. So a bottle cannot print the word Scotch whisky in large text and hide the word blended in tiny letters underneath. If it does, it is breaking the law. The reason this matters is that category confusion costs people money. A blended malt Scotch can be exceptional whiskey, assembled from the best casks at multiple distilleries, but because the word blended appears on the label, casual buyers assume it is a cheaper product. Meanwhile, some single-grain Scotch whiskies are bottled at 20 or 30 years old and sell for hundreds of pounds. But the category sounds unfamiliar, so they sit on the shelf. Knowing the 5 categories means you stop paying a premium for category names and start paying for what actually matters, which is the liquid. Number 9. The region name is not just marketing. When you see Highland or Speyside or Campbelltown on a label, those are legally protected geographical indications under the 2009 regulations, similar to how champagne can only come from Champagne. There are 5 protected Scotch regions: Highland, Lowland, Speyside, the island region that produces some of Scotland's most heavily peated whisky, and Campbelltown. A distillery cannot put a region name on the label unless it physically distilled that whisky in that region. The Scotch Whisky Association enforces this worldwide. They once took legal action against a Canadian distillery called Macaloney's Caledonian for using terms like Caledonian, Glen, and Island whisky because those words were too closely associated with Scottish geography. But here is what the region name does not tell you. It does not guarantee a flavour profile. Not every whisky from the Peat Smoke Island tastes like a campfire. Bunnahaven, one of the largest distilleries on that island, makes an unpeated whisky that tastes like toffee and roasted nuts. And not every Speyside is light and fruity. The region sets expectations, but the distillery sets the rules. Number 8. Matured in and finished in are not the same thing. This is where label language gets deliberately slippery. When a bottle says matured in Oloroso sherry casks, it means the whiskey spent its entire life in those casks. Every year of aging happened in contact with wood that previously held sherry. That is the real deal. When a bottle says finished in port casks or port cask finish, it means the whiskey spent most of its life in something else, usually ex-bourbon barrels, and was then transferred to port casks for a shorter secondary maturation. That finishing period could be 6 months, it could be 3 years. The label does not have to tell you. When a bottle says finished with a particular cask type, the language gets even vaguer. The Scotch Whisky Association permits maturation in casks that previously held wine, beer, ale, or spirits, with some exceptions. Casks that held stone fruit spirits or flavoured beer are off limits. But there is no legal requirement to tell you how long the whisky spent in any particular cask, or what percentage of the final product came from which cask type. A whisky that spent 11 years in refill bourbon barrels and 6 weeks in a sherry cask can market itself as a sherry cask expression, and many do. The label does not distinguish between a whisky that lived in sherry wood for its entire life and one that got a brief holiday in a sherry barrel before bottling. That distinction matters enormously for what you taste. A fully matured sherry cask whisky delivers deep dried fruit, dark chocolate, and baking spice that goes all the way through. A short sherry finish adds a pleasant top note, but the core character of the whisky remains whatever the primary cask gave it. Both can be good whisky. Only one of them is worth paying a sherry cask premium for. Number 7. First fill versus refill, and why the label stays quiet. A first fill cask is one being used for Scotch for the first time after holding its original spirit, whether that was bourbon, sherry, rum, or wine. It still has enormous flavour to give. A refill cask, sometimes called second fill or third fill, has already been used once or more for Scotch whisky. Each time a cask gets refilled, it gives less flavour to the spirit. A first fill ex-bourbon barrel delivers big vanilla, coconut, and caramel. A third fill barrel of the same type delivers almost nothing. The difference in flavour impact is enormous, and yet most labels never mention it. You will occasionally see the words first fill on a bottle, usually from smaller distilleries or independent bottlers who know their audience cares. But the big brands almost never tell you. That dark, rich whisky you think came from the cask might owe its colour to something else entirely. Which brings us to number 6. Number 6. 40% is the floor, not the standard. By law, Scotch whisky must be bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume. That is the absolute legal minimum. and an uncomfortable number of mass-market Scotch whiskies are bottled at exactly that number. Not because 40% produces the best flavour, because it produces the most volume from the least amount of whiskey. Every percentage point above 40 means less water added to the barrel strength spirit before bottling, which means fewer bottles per cask, which means less profit per cask. When you see 40% on a label, you are looking at a whiskey that has been diluted to the maximum extent the law allows. Compare that to cask strength bottlings that come out of the barrel at 55%, 60%, or even 65%. You are getting a fundamentally different product at that concentration. Many whiskey enthusiasts consider 46% to be the minimum for a single malt that wants to be taken seriously, because above that threshold, chill filtration becomes unnecessary. The whiskey can handle cold temperatures and the addition of water without going cloudy. That 46% line is not a law, it is a quality signal. Distilleries like Springbank, Brewick-Laddock and Bunnahaven bottle significant portions of their range above 46% as standard. Glenfarclas bottles their 105 expression at 60%. Meanwhile, many of the biggest selling Scotch whiskies in the world sit at exactly 40%, the bare legal minimum. Look at the alcohol by volume before you look at the price. A whiskey bottled at 43% is already giving you a meaningfully different experience than one at 40. And a whiskey at 50% or above is in an entirely different category. Number 5. The age statement is the youngest whiskey in the bottle. This one catches people off guard. When a bottle says 12 years old, it does not mean the whiskey inside is 12 years old. It means the youngest whiskey in the bottle is 12 years old. The rest could be 15, 20, or 30 years old. The law only cares about the youngest drop. A blended Scotch might contain 99% 25-year-old whiskey and 1% 3-year-old whiskey, and legally it can only be marketed as a 3-year-old. This is exactly why so many brands choose to drop the age statement entirely rather than put a number on the label that makes their product look younger than it is. But here is where it gets interesting. A company called Compass Box tried to do the opposite. They wanted to tell consumers exactly what was in their blended malts, listing the age of every component. In 2015, they published the full recipes for 2 of their whiskies, including every distillery, every cask type, every age, and every proportion. An anonymous competitor reported them to the Scotch Whisky Association. Compass Box was told they were breaking the law. Under European Union regulations, a Scotch producer can either display the age of the youngest component or display no age information at all. There is no third option. Telling the customer more than the law requires is literally illegal. Compass Box launched a transparency campaign to change the regulations. They proposed giving producers the option, not the obligation, to disclose every component age in their whiskies. The campaign generated enormous public support. The regulations have not changed. Scotch whisky remains one of the only consumer products in the world where telling the customer exactly what they are buying is against the law. Think about that the next time you see a fancy name on a bottle where a number used to be. The data on this channel shows that over 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. That means you are showing up for the content, but the algorithm has no reason to show you the next video. If you care about what you are putting in your glass, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Number 4. No age statement does not mean no age. It means no transparency. NAS, or no age statement, has become one of the most divisive topics in whiskey. When a bottle carries no age, it simply means the producer chose not to tell you how old the youngest whiskey inside is. That whiskey must still be at least 3 years old by law, but at least 3 years old covers everything from a toddler to a grandfather. Most industry estimates put the average NAS single malt somewhere between 5 and 9 years old. The rise of NAS is not really about innovation, despite what the marketing departments say. Global demand for single malt Scotch surged in the 2000s, and distilleries started running through their aged inventory faster than they could replace it. When you cannot fill a bottle with 12-year-old whiskey because you sold too much of it 5 years ago, you have two options. You can sell the bottle as a 5-year-old, which sounds cheap, or you can remove the number entirely, give it an evocative name such as Storm or Signet or Corrie Vrecken, and charge the same price or more. The no-age statement NAS trend accelerated after Macallan replaced their 10, 12, and 15-year-old core range with gold, amber, sienna, and ruby. Other distilleries followed. Some no-age statement bottlings are genuinely excellent. Ardbeg's Ugadal and Aberlour Abunad are consistently rated among the best whiskies in their respective categories regardless of age. But plenty of no-age statement releases are simply younger whiskey in fancier packaging at older whiskey prices. And without a number on the label, you have no way to tell the difference without tasting it first. One thing worth knowing is that heavily peated whiskies tend to hide youth better than unpeated ones. The intense, smoky flavour masks the metallic, spirity character that young whiskey often carries. That is one reason so many no-age statement releases come from peated distilleries. The smoke provides cover. An unpeated no-age statement from a Highland distillery has nowhere to hide, and your palate will usually know it. Number 3. Chill filtration strips more than cloudiness. When whiskey comes out of a cask, it contains natural fatty acids, esters, and proteins from the distillation and maturation process. These compounds contribute to mouthfeel, texture, and subtle flavors. They also make the whiskey go slightly cloudy when you add cold water or ice. Since most casual drinkers expect a clear golden spirit in their glass, producers run the whiskey through a fine mesh filter at near freezing temperatures between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius for single malts. The fatty acids precipitate out, get caught in the filter, and the whiskey comes out sparkling clear. The problem is that those fatty acids are not just cosmetic. They carry flavor. Many whiskey enthusiasts describe the difference between a chill-filtered and non-chill-filtered version of the same whiskey as the difference between skimmed milk and whole milk. Same liquid, different body. And here is the transparency issue. There is no legal requirement to tell you whether a whiskey has been chill-filtered. The only bottles that volunteer this information are the ones that chose not to do it. Non-chill filtered on a label is a badge of honor. The absence of that phrase means nothing definitive, but statistically, if the bottle does not mention it, the whiskey has been filtered. One common misconception is that non-chill filtered also means natural color. It does not. A whiskey can skip chill filtration and still contain added color. The two processes are completely independent. Number 2. E150A, the colouring agent that does not have to be on the label. This is the one that genuinely surprises people. Under the Scotch whisky regulations of 2009, the only additive permitted in Scotch whisky other than water is E150A, also known as plain caramel or spirit caramel. It is a food colouring made by heating sugars like corn syrup or sucrose until they caramelize. It is used across the whiskey industry, not just in cheap blends, but in premium single malts. Lagavulin uses it, Dalmore uses it, Johnny Walker uses it. The official reason is batch consistency. Different casks produce different colours, and consumers expect the same bottle to look the same every time they buy it. The unofficial reason is that darker whiskey looks older, and older-looking whiskey sells for more money. Under European law, E150A can be used without restriction in Scotch whisky, and there is no requirement to declare it on the label. The only exception is Germany and parts of Scandinavia, where local regulations require caramel colouring to be disclosed. If you want to know whether your favourite Scotch contains added colour, check the German label. If it says Farbstoff on the German version and nothing on your version, you have your answer. Distilleries that voluntarily skip E150A tend to advertise it. Natural colour on a label means no caramel was added. The absence of that phrase is, once again, the tell. Bruichladdich does not use it, Springbank does not use it, Glenfarclas does not use it. Most independent bottlers like Gordon and MacPhail and Signatory skip it as standard. The brands that stay quiet are the ones reaching for the dropper bottle. And here is the uncomfortable truth about E150A. The industry tells consumers to evaluate whiskey partly by its colour. Tasting notes describe golden amber, deep mahogany, rich copper. Distillery tours explain how different casks produce different hues. And then those same producers add food colouring to make the whiskey darker than it would naturally be. You cannot simultaneously tell people that colour is a meaningful indicator of quality and then artificially adjust the colour. That is the definition of deception, regardless of whether the additive itself is harmless. Number 1. Teaspooning, the industry's most creative trick for keeping you in the dark. This is the one almost nobody outside the whiskey trade knows about. When a distillery sells casks to blending companies or brokers, those casks are supposed to end up in blended Scotch. The distillery gets paid, the blender gets whiskey, everyone is happy. The problem starts when independent bottlers get their hands on those casks. An independent bottler might buy a single cask of whiskey from a famous distillery and bottle it under that distillery's name. The distillery has no control over which casks get selected, how they are bottled, or what quality they represent. A bad independent bottling with a famous distillery name on it could damage the brand. So some distilleries came up with a solution. Before selling a cask, they add a tiny amount of whiskey from a different distillery. 1 teaspoon is enough. That single teaspoon means the cask is no longer a single malt. It is now technically a blended malt, and under the 2009 regulations, it cannot legally be sold under one distillery's name. The independent bottler can still sell it, but they cannot tell you where it came from. They can only list the general region or use their own brand name. You, the consumer, lose information. You can no longer identify what you are drinking, and the distillery's reputation stays protected. Whether you think that is a reasonable business practice or a deliberate effort to control the market depends on your perspective. But the fact remains that teaspooning exists specifically to prevent transparency, and it is perfectly legal. Compare that to Compass Box, which was told that providing too much information was illegal, and you start to see a pattern. The Scotch whisky industry has a complicated relationship with the truth. The labels that tell you the most, the ones that say natural colour, non-chill filtered, first fill, bottled at 46%. Those are the ones volunteering information they are not required to give. And the labels that tell you the least, the ones with a fancy name, a dark colour and no numbers anywhere, those are the ones hiding behind every gap in the regulations. The good news is that the label still tells you more than you think, if you know where to look. The bad news is that what the label leaves out tells you even more. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing, and we will see you in the next one.